Captain, I might have smoked just one joint, but not aboard ship. I was on the beach at a party.
The Navy cannot tolerate drug use, anywhere, at any time. I find you have committed the offense charged. As charged, I impose the following punishment. The following punishment. The following punishment. The following punishment. Punishment. Punishment.
If I had to take a random guess, odds are EBM is probably not a genre you were too familiar with. Unless, of course, you are cool, attractive, and interesting like myself. EBM, not to be confused with EDM, stands for Electronic Body Music, or alternatively, Electronic Body Movement. If EDM is the sociable, well-developed wild child of the family, EBM is the scary, greasy cousin who's probably been to jail but has a cool collection of animal teeth, or something. Here I am going to outline a brief history of the subgenre of music and analyze its common themes from historical and artistic lenses in an attempt to better understand it as a proper movement. Like all of the greatest music ever made, the roots of EBM can be traced back to none other than Kraftwerk. Kraftwerk, without a doubt, is one of the most influential groups of all time, whether you may realize it or not. As pioneers of pretty much every type of electronic music as we know it today, they reinvented the music scene of post-war Germany and became a sort of worldwide musical art exhibit. Kraftwerk was formed by Ralf Hütter and Florian Schneider in Dusseldorf, 1970. Their innovative use of synthesizers, vocoders, drum machines, and other forms of creative electronic instrumentation led to their signature robotic sound. In an almost uncanny way, Kraftwerk commits to presenting themselves as a band of robots, moving in stiff, calculated jerks during their live performances and music videos. The way they experiment and blur the lines between the mechanical and the human is the foundation of which EBM was born on. In 1977, they coined the term Die Mensch Machine, which inspired the offshoot genre in Germany and Belgium just a few years later. The term Körpermusik began getting tossed around in the early 80s by group DAF in an attempt to describe the new sound they were formulating. The core of EBM is that it is heavily industrial, perhaps more stripped down compared to other electronic-based music genres. It's characteristically rhythm-heavy with its synths and drum machines, but undeniably visceral with its aggressive vocals. It relies on a more primitive sound. 4/4 kick and snare with repetitive, pulsating bass lines. This is where EBM begins to differ from the kinds of work that Kraftwerk was experimenting in. EBM not only puts the human element back into the equation, but it throws it into your face, often with guttural shouts and gravelly drones. EBM works within only a few layers to create powerful beats in this industrial punk and electronic dance combination. In the early days, EBM mostly stayed within Germany and Belgium, as at the time that was the powerhouse of electronic music innovation. By the late 80s, we see groups like Nitzer Ebb pop up in England. Skinny Puppy and later on Frontline Assembly in North America. Popé Fabrik in Sweden. And even Soft Ballet in Japan. Despite its niche appeal and relatively small cult following, EBM began to spread across the world and take on new forms with the passing decade. In the 90s, a lot of prominent names in EBM began to disappear, or shift their direction, mostly into heavier, more rock-oriented sound, perhaps better suited for more mainstream success. While some groups like And1 and Front 242 shifted to explore a more electronic-focused version of the genre, during this time, the signature EBM sound all in all seemed to fizzle out into its larger umbrella of rock and metal, becoming nearly indiscernible from the more mainstream grit that had begun topping the rock charts of the new decade, like that of Nine Inch Nails. However, there's no need to fret your little buzzed heads, because seemingly against the odds, EBM saw a resurgence in the 2000s. While it continues to simmer among the underground, just as it did in its early years, new groups like Combichrist began to adopt and reiterate on the old-school EBM sound, and DJs began utilizing the genre's untapped potential in their mixes for a punchier yet still danceable feel to their industrial sets. EBM-adjacent groups like KMFDM and Ministry also began seeing success from similar circles and contributed to the evolution of the humble genre all the same. With our loose timeline laid out, we can now begin taking a look at some of the outside factors that inspired the early days of EBM and the distinct culture and look of the sound. The EBM coming out of Belgium and Germany in the late 70s and early 80s was often characterized by the shouted, command-style vocals, evoking strong imagery of a harsh, militaristic setting, a merciless general, unthinkable demands. Meanwhile, the repetitive electronic beats seem to imply uniform compliance, stiff, strict 4x4 marches, slowly stripping you of all of your humanity. It is here we begin to see the familiar themes of transhumanism and posthumanism, introduced by early electronica, but this time under the context of the command of another human instead of a machine. EBM is about playing with the idea of being forced into something more akin to a robot, in an attempt to forcibly remove your sense of humanity, for the sake of control, in the angry defiance against the totalitarian state.
Communism denies religion and debases the individual to a part of the vast machine that powers the state.
With this context in mind, it isn't uncommon for rock, metal, and punk groups to utilize problematic imagery to further drive home the point of their music. EBM took part in this as well. Some groups align themselves closely with symbols of the working class, appealing to those who relate to the struggles of forced uniformity and political distrust. Others took the opposite route, aligning themselves with a false nostalgia for fascism through their use of symbols relating to communism. For example, hammer and cogwheel iconography are commonly associated in this instance, and, keeping in mind the context of the time, location, and subject matter, Nazism. Leather and elements of military garments also became part of the aesthetic to drive forward the human-machine dichotomy within fascism. The machismo desire to become triumphant and hold power over others, and perhaps elements of masochism that may come with subjecting oneself to the mental horrors of willful submission and control under a surveillance state. While not necessarily reflective of the group's personal beliefs, I do find it important to look beyond face value and keep in mind the context of the use of hateful and controversial symbols and paraphernalia, and what purpose beyond reflecting a belief they may be serving here. To make people angry? Well, obviously, it wouldn't be punk without controversy, but also perhaps to reflect on a darker time in history in the form of retrospective, artistic expression. Sound pretentious? Maybe, but I do think it's important to ask ourselves why we may be so adverse to the more controversial forms of reclamation, and EBM and the wider genre of punk are among the movements that provide a space to explore just that. Moving on. Rivethead is a term sometimes used to describe somebody who is a fan of or associated with industrial dance music. While also not exactly exclusive to EBM, the cross-pollination of the scene is undeniable. To the untrained eye, the average beta male goth may be mistaken for the Chad Rivethead. I don't know why I kept that in the script, I'm so sorry. The difference, of course, is the emphasis on the more strict militaristic look. Combat boots, cargo pants, black leather, buzz cuts, bomber jackets, trench coats, and for the more ambitious, maybe the occasional gas mask or flight goggles. Other variations of the Rivethead subculture expand far beyond EBM. This is an arbitrary label for listeners of a vague subgenre of music. With that said, some more extreme Rivetheads may lean into the colorful themes of the larger industrial techno scene. And I do mean that literally. Bright neon accents, large dramatic hair accessories, spikes, studs, buckles, tubes, you name it. This is all more closely related to what you'd call cybergoth, as opposed to the old-school EBM that we're talking about here. Think like 2000s MySpace scene, but it's the future, and also the apocalypse. You'll see a lot of biohazard and radioactivity symbols here, as opposed to the fascism and socialism iconography, but that also can be traced back to Kraftwerk's legacy, so look at that, it comes back around. The term Rivethead was actually coined in the 1940s in reference to the lower and middle-class workers of automotive assembly lines. From there, you can begin to see the link between the original use of the term for industrial factory workers to that of its relation to the industrial music scene. It's even in the name. Despite remaining rather underground in its original form, EBM has influenced modern electronic music in a big way, thanks to its unabashed, unique sound. Early EBM groups pioneered the use of synthesizers to create a minimalist, dark, and aggressive fusion of dance and punk, and inspired various offshoots of the sound in later years, leading to more interesting genre labels. While I still personally see hyper-specific music genre labels as redundant and, let's face it, often pointlessly restrictive, I find EBM to be an important innovation of sound and expression that is often overlooked. This is undoubtedly one of my favorite genres of music, and one I identify very closely with. So, as self-indulgent as this video may have been, I hope it was enough to call your attention to the interesting phenomena of these micro-movements within music history, and appreciate those who are unafraid of making weird shit. Thank you for joining me on this short little exploration. If you enjoy looking into culture in the form of music, I have a previous video on Eurobeat. I also really quickly want to take this opportunity to thank you for the traffic that video received, as it was far more than I could have expected from such a tiny channel like this. Anyway, that's all for now. My name is Circumcision. I'll see you all very soon.